November 3rd, 1957. On the eve of the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists had once again made history, for on this day the Soviet Union sent the first living being into orbit around the Earth. A 2-year-old mixed-breed dog named Laika. At over 1,600 kilometers from the surface, Laika was now the loneliest dog that had ever existed. Her eyes witnessed a universe in such a way that was only dreamt of before by mankind. Innocent eyes looking out into the dark void beyond. Laika could barely move in her small capsule. Her breath was fast and her heartbeat was even faster. The sound of the rockets and the speed of her ascent had frightened her beyond belief. Soon the air around her began to warm and quickly became unbearable. The journey quickly descended from one nightmare to another. Laika could not run, for she was trapped, and her barks would go unheard. No rescue was possible, and no return home was anticipated. Her fate had been doomed from before the rocket had even left the ground. Laika would soon give out to the heat, and eventually she and her spacecraft would re-enter the atmosphere and burn up in the sky. This was the fate of Laika, the space dog, the first living being to orbit the Earth, the one that would clear the way for man's eventual journey to space. Here, she had become a victim of man's hubris. In this video, I'm going to discuss the Sputnik 2 rocket launch, why and how it happened, its significance to the space race, and ultimately, the life and death of Laika, the tragic space dog. On June 20th, 1944, 2 weeks after D-Day, the Germans made history by launching the first rocket into space. The V-2 rocket named MW18014 would reach a maximum height of 176 kilometers, entering into what we today define as space. However, the Germans wouldn't get any further, as launch sites were damaged by enemy raids, and Germany itself was overrun by the Allies in less than a year. But this wouldn't be the end of humanity's journey to space, because at the end of the Second World War, both the United States and the Soviet Union would establish their own space programs, with the help of their own rocket scientists and those recruited from Germany. By 1957, the United States and the Soviet Union had already launched a multitude of rockets into space, some even carrying living passengers such as flies, monkeys, and dogs. However, neither country had accomplished a long sought-out goal, putting a spacecraft into orbit around the Earth. But this would soon become a reality, as advances in science were exploding in the 1950s. To enhance humanity's efforts at discovering the unknown, scientists from around the world established the International Geophysical Year that would last from July 1st, 1957 to December 31st, 1958. Here, 67 nations would participate and coordinate with one another to study the Earth itself, particularly to study its atmosphere, poles, and its relationship with the Sun. As part of this effort, both the United States and the Soviet Union declared that they would place artificial satellites into orbit during the International Geophysical Year. The Soviets had planned to send a large satellite weighing over 1,000 kilograms into space. It would contain a host of scientific instruments for geophysical research. However, due to its size and complexity, the satellite wouldn't be ready until 1958. This, however, wasn't soon enough for the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev feared that the United States would reach orbit first and outdo the Soviets. Therefore, he wanted a satellite ready to launch by late 1957. To meet the timetable set out by Khrushchev, Sergei Korolev, one of the main heads of the Soviet rocket program, proposed that while Sputnik 3 was being developed, the Soviets could, in the meantime, develop a simpler satellite. These simpler satellites would soon become known as Sputnik 1 and 2. Sputnik 1 was essentially a small silver sphere with a handful of scientific instruments, with 4 radio antennas to transmit data back to the surface. On October 4th, 1957, Sputnik 1 was successfully launched, and would become the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. It would complete a total of 1,440 orbits before falling back to the Earth and burning up in the atmosphere. Sputnik 1 would transmit invaluable information and played a pivotal role in the exploration of space. But it also achieved its main purpose, to outdo the Americans and allow the Soviets to claim victory as being the first to launch a spacecraft into orbit. So great was his achievement that it would cause a crisis in the United States and trigger what we know today as the space race, a race that would climax with the Apollo-level landings on the moon. However, before man would reach space themselves, man's best friend would have to lead the way. To celebrate the launch of Sputnik 1, Khrushchev hosted a celebration with the leading rocket scientists of the Soviet Union. Among them was Sergei Korolev. It is believed that during this reception, Khrushchev took Sergei aside and suggested that another Sputnik be launched to mark the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which had occurred on November 7, 1917. This would mean that Soviet scientists would have less than a month to build and launch a completely new satellite. Of course, a suggestion from the leader of the Soviet Union is usually treated as a command. But before Korolev would give Khrushchev an official answer to his suggestion, Korolev would convene with other rocket scientists and engineers to discuss the idea of Sputnik 2 and its feasibility. Korolev and his fellow compatriots would decide that Sputnik 2 would not simply be a repeat of Sputnik 1. Instead, Sputnik 2 would be a large leap forward. The Soviets had, for some time, planned to send a man into orbit. But before this could be done, the Soviets wanted to ensure that such a feat was survivable and determine what impacts it had on living beings. To test this query, Korolev himself would suggest that they would send a dog into space. The Sputnik 2 rocket would be outfitted with a special capsule that would contain a dog cabin with a primitive life support system and an automatic feeding mechanism that would allow the dog to survive long enough to confirm whether such a trip was survivable and whether it was also possible to eat in a zero-gravity environment. The same spherical satellite with a dog cabin attached would be used once again. The satellite would also contain scientific instruments to collect other data, and the same ICBM rocket would be used to carry Sputnik 2 into space. Also, the journey would be one way, and it was expected that the dog would not survive. All of these shortcuts and more would allow the scientists to fast-track the project. Korolev had now realized that Khrushchev's suggestion was quite possible, and by mid-October, it had been decided that Sputnik 2 would launch into space just in time to celebrate the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Moscow is a city that is known for many things: the Kremlin, the Red Square, and the winters. But what a lot of people don't know is that it's a city of stray dogs. Around 35,000 stray dogs walk its streets today, and back in 1957, a young 2-year-old mongrel who would come to be known as Laika was one of them. She was believed to be a part husky and terrier mix, and it was allegedly named Laika due to her loud barking. Laika would be picked off the streets by Soviet authorities and given the great honor of dying for the motherland to advance science. As a dog that had already proven herself of being capable of surviving the harsh winters of Moscow, she was ideal for the harsh conditions in space, or at least strong enough to survive long enough to provide valuable data to Soviet scientists. Laika would be among 3 dogs chosen for the mission. She would be joined by Albina and Mushka. Mushka would remain on the ground and serve as a control dog, and Albina, because she had just given birth, would remain behind as well. Apparently, the Soviet scientists didn't want to separate a mother from her pups. As a result, Laika would be the one to go. To prepare her for the small confines and isolation of her journey, Laika would progressively be placed in smaller and smaller cages for a period of 20 days. During this time, Laika's health would suffer, making her restless and even making it harder for her to urinate or defecate. She would also be placed in a centrifuge to stimulate the forces that she would face when accelerating into space, and speakers were used to simulate the sound of the rockets that she would hear. These experiences would absolutely terrify her and lead to a noticeable increase in her blood pressure and heart rate. Laika would also be slowly trained to begin eating a special gel that was 40% breadcrumbs, 40% powdered meat, and 20% beef fat. Once her training was complete and it was getting close to November 1957, Vladimir Yazdovsky, one of the leads who helped train the dogs, decided to take Laika home one day to play with his children. Vladimir would one day write that Laika was quiet and charming. "I want to do something nice for her. She has so little time left to live." Soon after, a surgery would be performed on Laika, where she would have sensors attached to her body to monitor her vital signs. On October 31st, 1957, Laika would be taken to the Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, from where the rocket would be launched. Laika was placed in the capsule, and before it was closed, one of the technicians at the base would give her one last kiss. The technician would recount saying, "After placing Laika in the container and before closing the hatch, we kissed her nose and wished her bon voyage, knowing that she would not survive the flight." At 5:30 a.m. November 3rd, 1957, Sputnik 2 lifted off for the stars. On the way up, Laika's breathing increased 3 to 4 times what it was before the launch, and her heartbeat increased from 103 beats per minute to 240 beats per minute. She was in an intense state of stress. The acceleration, the G-forces, the shaking of the rocket, combined with the noise, would have been beyond terrifying for her. Once in orbit, after about 3 hours, Laika's heartbeat has settled down to 102 beats per minute. It had taken 3 times longer for her to settle down in space than it had during her training on the surface, a clear signal that Laika's journey to space had taken a stressful toll on her. Regardless, Soviet scientists were able to confirm that Laika was active and eating her food. But as I said before, no one on the surface had intended for Laika to survive the journey and return to Earth. Sputnik 2 had been put together in a rush, and the life support systems had been quickly assembled. The main point of the launch was to test what the effects would be on a living being once they journeyed to space, and also to take scientific measurements in space. What happened after that had been achieved wasn't much of a concern. Laika would quickly discover that her own owners had put her in a coffin. In the first 3 orbits, Laika has shown normal breathing and heartbeat. Movements had even been detected in the 3rd orbit, but soon a fatal change would emerge. In the 3rd orbit, the internal temperature of the Sputnik capsule would reach 43 degrees. The thermal insulation that had been installed was now starting to fail, and soon the extreme heat would kill Laika. It is believed that Laika died within 5 to 6 hours after launch. At the age of 2, born in Moscow, Laika had passed away in Earth's orbit. For a time, the Soviet Union would cover up the exact details of her passing. First, it was stated that she had survived for days and died from a lack of oxygen. There had been stories that she had been euthanized with poisoned food. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, Soviet scientists would reveal that Laika had indeed died from overheating, sometime in the 4th orbit. But even if Laika had survived the first few days, her luck would have soon run out anyhow, because 6 days after launch, the batteries on Sputnik 2 ran out, and all systems on board would be dead. Despite this, Sputnik 2 would continue to orbit the Earth until April 14, 1958, when they finally re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and burned up. Its fire trail would be spotted burning in the atmosphere from New York City to the Amazon. Laika's ashes would be spread across the world. After the news of the launch became public, there would be international outcry over the treatment of Laika. Animal rights activists protested the use of the dog in a brutal ordeal. Her last moments would have certainly been terrifying. But for the Soviet Union and Nikita Khrushchev, it was a stunning victory, a sign of the Soviet Union's technological superiority and advantage in the space race, a victory for communism over capitalism. But years after the mission, some members of the launch team would begin to show discontent. Oleg Gazniko, a member of the Sputnik 2 launch team, would state that work with animals is a source of suffering to us all. We treat them like babies who cannot speak. The more time passes, the more I'm sorry about it. We shouldn't have done it. We did not learn enough from the mission to justify the death of the dog. But many in the Soviet Union at the time and even today contend that sending an animal first was a necessary sacrifice to ensure that the eventual launch of humans into orbit would be safe. Something the Soviet Union successfully managed to accomplish in 1961, just 4 years after Sputnik 2. Regardless of which side you fall on, I think we can all agree that this was a tragic episode all around. An innocent dog was knowingly sent to her death for the sake of progress, launched on a spacecraft that had been quickly slapped together to meet the tight date requested by Khrushchev, who himself wanted to outdo the Americans and make it symbolically tie with the Bolshevik Revolution. To be fair, the revolution itself required a bit of blood to succeed, so perhaps it was only appropriate that further blood would be shed on its anniversary, for the sake of advancing communist goals once again. I think it's always good to appreciate just how much death and suffering have been experienced to get us, well, everything worth having today. Whether it's the country you live in, your rights and freedoms, or even the technology that you take for granted, the food in the supermarket, and so much more. This should remind us to always cherish life and be grateful that it was someone else who made the sacrifice. Conclusion. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's the unfortunate and terrifying tale of Laika the space dog, the first living being to orbit the Earth. It's honestly quite scary to imagine what it would have felt like for the dog, launching into space at incredibly high speed, the noise and the violent shaking, the G-forces pressing against you, and then once arriving in space, being in an environment that no other dog had ever seen before, the vast empty void, and then being cooked alive in your capsule. Honestly, if the Soviet scientists had been given more time, I'm sure that they could have designed something that could have not only had a better life support system, but one that could have returned the dog to Earth, as they would successfully do in 1961 when the first human was sent to space and safely returned. But for the sake of geopolitics, Laika had to be sacrificed. The Soviet leadership needed a victory to outdo the United States and symbolically honor the Bolshevik Revolution. Unfortunate, but at least Laika's sacrifice wasn't in vain, because in the time since, enormous leaps have been made in the field of space travel. So next time you look to the stars, remember Laika, for she is among them.